In this video, I'll present information from Chapter 11 of Human Anatomy and Physiology, 11th edition. This chapter focuses on nervous tissues. In particular, we'll be looking at the cell types of the nervous system, including the glial cells and neurons. Here's just a brief listing of an overview of the 7 different cell types of the nervous system. You'll see that in the case of glial cells, there are 4 different cell types that are found in the central nervous system, and there are 2 other cell types that are glia that are found in the peripheral nervous system. Neurons can be found in both the periphery and in the central nervous system. You can also hopefully see here that glial cells are defined as cells that support neurons, whereas neurons are excitable cells that are transmitting electrical signals. So let's look one at a time through each of these 7 cell types. Starting with astrocytes. This is the most abundant glial cell in the central nervous system. It's highly branched, as shown in this illustration, and it has functions that include direct support of neurons, forming connections between neurons and the blood supply coming through this capillary, and the control of the chemical environment of neurons. Next up, we have microglia. These are also small cells with lots of thorny processes. They are the resident immune cells of the central nervous system. So, thanks in part to this barrier that is formed between the blood and the brain by these astrocytes, it's very difficult for materials to get from the blood to the brain and vice versa. That means that it's difficult for immune cells to cross into the brain. Luckily, that means that those immune cells can't cause inflammation in the brain, but it also means that the brain is a sensitive spot for infections and other issues. And so we do have these resident immune cells, the microglia. They're phagocytic cells, so that means that they phagocytose microorganisms and neuronal debris, and they can do so quickly before any other cells of the immune system are able to respond and break through that blood-brain barrier. Next, we have ependymal cells. These are basically an epithelial layer, but they line the coverings, they line the cavities of the brain and the spinal cord. So your brain and spinal cord have these cavities that are filled with fluid. The fluid is called the cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebro as in brain, spinal as in spinal cord, cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. And it turns out this is very important fluid for your brain's function. And in order for it to function properly, this fluid needs to be circulated well. And that's the job of these ependymal cells. They circulate the cerebrospinal fluid through the cavities of the brain and spinal column. Next up, we have oligodendrocytes. This is the last cell type that we're finding specifically in the central nervous system, so the brain and the spinal cord. These are again branched cells. You can see this cell appears to have 3 branches, this one has 4. The bottom line function for an oligodendrocyte is that it produces myelin and wraps the neuronal processes in that myelin. So here's some axons shown in yellow, and the oligodendrocytes are surrounding those axons with myelin. Now we can look out in the peripheral nervous system, and we find these 2 cell types in the peripheral nervous system. These 2 glial cell types have very similar functions to cells we've already looked at. So for instance, these satellite cells, they're only found in the peripheral nervous system, but their functions are very similar to astrocytes, so support of neurons. Schwann cells, also only found in the PNS, their function is similar to oligodendrocytes. So these Schwann cells form myelin sheaths around the nerve fibers in the peripheral nervous system. And finally, we have neurons themselves. So these are those excitable cells within the nervous system. They're quite large cells compared to the glia we've just looked at. They live a very long time, so they can potentially live your entire lifetime. And they don't divide. so they are amitotic. This means you might be born with a neuron. That neuron will never divide and might be with you for your entire life. Additionally, the brain, and these neurons in particular, have incredibly high metabolic rates. This is one of the reasons why, although the brain is only 2.5% of your body weight, it is thought to use about 20% or 1/5 of your body's metabolic energy at any given moment. These are very needy and very sensitive cells, but they're also very excitable, which is important for us. If we look closely at a neuron, we'll see that it has three basic parts. Number one, it has a cell body. This is sort of the boring part. It's what looks like a cell. This sort of round or sometimes triangular looking cell body then has the exciting bits, which are the processes. And there are two types of neuronal process. One is a dendrite, and you can see this neuron and most neurons have multiple dendrites coming off the cell body. And then there's also axons, and typically a neuron has one big axon that connects to the cell body at this location called an axon hillock. So the axon connects to the cell body at the axon hillock. And this is also where the action potentials are going to start, as we'll see later. So two types of processes, dendrites and axons. And finally, for this slide, there's a one-way movement of signals through neurons. So signals are going to come into the neurons through the dendrites. So the dendrites receive signals and send those signals toward the cell body. So signals come in through the dendrites and then move out through the axon. So all electrical signals will travel from dendrite to cell body to axon and then out the axon terminals. Finally, in this section, I wanted to introduce you to some vocabulary words used to describe the organization of neurons in the CNS and the PNS. So first we have two words that are used to describe clusters of nerves, or clusters of neurons, and in particular the cell bodies of those neurons. So in the central nervous system, those clusters of neurons are called nuclei. So each nucleus is typically a cluster of neurons that are dedicated to very similar purposes. In the peripheral nervous system, those clusters of neuronal cell bodies are called ganglia. So a ganglion is going to just basically look like a little bulb that's attached to a nerve outside of the brain and spinal cord, so in the peripheral nervous system. Then we have a similar breakdown for bundles of neuron processes. So typically these are axons. Doesn't have to be, but typically they are bundles of axons. And so if you find a bundle of axons, so basically axons coming from many different neurons, in the CNS, that bundle of neuronal processes is called a tract. If you find a bundle of neuronal processes in the peripheral nervous system, we call that a fiber. So again, both of these are bundles of neuronal processes, but one in the CNS is called a tract, and one in the PNS is called fiber. So I will leave you with this question about cell types.